Hello, guys. It's nice to have you here with me. So we'll be going into the class. We'll be starting the class now. Uh, this is going to be a 6 week boot camp on web development, and we'll be going over the basics of web development. We'll be going over HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Yeah, and so while going through the feedback, I sent out a form, right? A feedback form, and about 16 people, last time I checked, had filled the form. So while going through that, I found out that most of us are beginners, like complete beginners, right? So I'll keep that at the back of my mind, and so I'll be trying my best to go really slowly so that we can all follow along. All right. So today would be looking at the basics of web development. The What I mean by basics now, the concepts that you need to understand to be a good web developer. Right. Everything about web development is not just coding per se. Right. So we'll be looking at some of the fundamental concepts that you would need to understand while starting out your web development journey. Okay, so let me share the slide I prepared. All right, so can we see the slide? If you can see the slide, leave me a message in the chat box. All right, so we can see the slides. All right, so let's get into the class. All right, so it's going to be a beginner friendly class that's going to walk you through the basics of web development, right? Never mind the Spider-Man logo, right? Okay, so before we start, let me introduce myself. Right, so in case you don't already know, my name is Malomoto Lope, and I'm a front-end engineer, and I'm also a student at Federal University of Technology, Akure Futa. I'm in my fourth year right now. Okay, so I actually started coding about 8 years ago. Yes, when I was in secondary school. How did it happen? So it's a very funny story actually. One of my friends visited me, and he came to collect some movies from my laptop, right? I used to watch movies a lot back then. So he came to collect movies on my laptop, and so he gave me a flash drive, and while I was going through the flash drive, I was like, oh, let me see if this guy also has movies I can collect, right? So while going through the flash drive, I stumbled across a video, right? And the title of the video was "How to Make Your Own Game." Right? I used to be in love with video games back then. I used to play a lot of video games. So I saw that video, "How to Make Your Own Game" using Unity, right? And so I was excited about the idea of being able to create my own games. And so I opened the video and started watching it, and that was the beginning of my coding journey, right? So from there I started using YouTube videos to learn about game development. I didn't eventually become a game developer. I think shortly after that time was when I got introduced to web development, right? And so it's been 8 years now, and I can say I've gotten pretty good at what I do, right? Recently, my team won second place at Chakra UI's hackathon. For most of you won't know what Chakra UI is because you're beginners, right? But Chakra UI is a tool that we use in web development, right? So my team won second place, and my team comprised of myself and one of my friends who is also studying computer science in my school. And immediately after that, I also got accepted into Google Summer of Code, where I worked with Joplin, an open source organization, for about 3 months. Yeah. So it's been 8 years now, and since I started learning web development, and the journey hasn't been that smooth, right? It hasn't been done that smooth. But one thing I want to point out is you guys have an advantage that I didn't have when I was starting, and that's having someone to walk you through web development. When I started learning web development, I was learning on my own. Basically, I had almost maybe just one person I knew who was also a web developer. But you guys have me, you have this boot camp to help you walk through the basics, and that is a really, really huge advantage, right? It's a huge advantage to be able to have someone to walk you through this learning process, right? You probably know we have a lot of resources all over the internet that teach web development, but despite those resources, it's still not that easy, right? Because you would have the issue of, oh, what do I learn first? What do I learn after I've learned this, right? So it's still very confusing. In fact, the materials can be overwhelming, right? But when you have someone to guide you, it's going to be easier, right? And that's what this boot camp would be doing for you. Yes, that's what the boot camp is doing for you. All right, so let's get started. Enough talk. Let's get started. All right. So now, when it comes to learning web development or anything, your mindset is very important. Your mindset is very important, right? It sounds cliche, but it's the truth. Your mindset is very, very important. So that's why I decided to start the class with some tips to help you succeed as a developer. And number one tip I have here is to get your hands dirty. Try it yourself, right? So as I'm teaching, I'll be after we get past all these concepts, the theoretical parts, we'll be having a lot of practicals, right? I'll be showing you things, I'll be writing code live, and you guys will be following along, right? So when we're doing that, it's very, very important that you're not just watching like you're watching a movie. No. If you're just watching like you're watching a movie, you won't gain anything, or you gain very little out of this. So it's very, very important that the things that you are learning, you try them yourself. That's how you're going to become a world-class developer. You need to try these things yourself, right? So the second tip I have is to be curious and be childlike. Yeah, be curious. And I feel like this also applies to every other endeavor, right? When you are curious, what does that mean? That means that, I tell you this is how something works. A curious person will ask me, why is it like this? Or what if I do it another way? Is it still going to work, right? This is one of the mindsets that is going to help you to excel as a developer. Then the third thing is to build, work on projects. Yes, right? So how good you are going to become, or how good you are as a developer, is actually going to be dependent on how much projects you've worked on, right? As I'm explaining these things, it will be like, oh, I've actually gotten this makes sense, right? But the real learning happens when you work on projects. That is, when you are off this video, when nobody is there to help you, you're just on your own, you're writing the code on your own, you're building the project on your own. That's where the real learning happens, right? So it should not just be that, you're joining on Tuesday by 4 p.m. to just watch the video, and after you watch the video, that's the end of it. Now you're not going to learn that way, right? The real learning happens when you build projects. Okay, and so the next tip is to have developers in your circle of friends, right? Have developers in your circle of friends. That means make friends with people who are web developers as well, right? Now, when you first start learning web development, most times it's going to be very exciting. You're going to be enjoying the process. Oh wow, I can do this, I can do that. Web development is really fun, right? But it actually gets to a point where it's not that fun anymore. It gets to a point where you might struggle with understanding some concepts. You might struggle with understanding how some things work. So something that's going to help you at that point is when you have friends that do similar things, right? That's really going to help you. I can't emphasize this enough, right? You need to have friends that are also web developers, and yeah, you can start from here, right? You can make friends from people in this class, right? You can message people, you can network, right? So that you guys can help yourself to succeed as developers. All right, and the next thing is learn to read documentation and blogs. Learn to read. Yeah. So when you're learning web development, or as you progress in your web development journey, you would find out that there are some things you can't learn from videos. There are a lot of videos on YouTube, and I actually suggest watching videos. They will help. They will really help. But there are some things you can't learn by watching videos. There are some things you just have to read, right? A lot of people don't like to read because it can be very mentally tasking. But you need to learn how to read, right? You need to learn how to read. That's going to help you as a developer. And then the other thing is to learn to read other people's code. Learn to read other people's code. This is also going to help you. You're going to learn from how people write their code when you do this. Okay, and then the next thing is Google it, YouTube it, then ask for help. Now, this is talking about when you encounter a blocker. So, what do I mean by a blocker? So, a blocker is, you're working on something, you're working on this website, and you're trying to make a particular part of the website work, but you can't seem to move forward. That's what the blocker is, right? So what do you do when you have blockers? Now, what you should do is, first of all, Google it. Search it on Google. How do I fix this? I do that every day. I do that several times a day. That's the life of a developer. We Google things a lot. Okay, and if you can't seem to find it on Google, then also YouTube it, right? YouTube has vast amount of materials to help you as a developer. Okay, I can see someone raising their hands. Okay, you can unmute yourself and ask your question, or say what you want to say. Oh, he has left the meeting. Okay, Basi, you raised your hand. Do you have a question? If you have a question, you can unmute yourself and ask a question. But otherwise, we'll move on. Alright, so okay, someone else raised. Okay, unmute yourself and okay. Good afternoon. So I didn't hear your question. Come again, please. Yes. So I was talking about. All right. So I was talking about when you start building projects, when you start working on websites, and you encounter blockers. So I explained what a blocker is. A blocker is a situation where you've been trying to do something for a long time, maybe one day, maybe 2 days, maybe even 2 weeks, and you're not able to move forward. That's what a blocker is, and this happens quite a lot in software development, in web development. You would encounter blockers a lot. So I'm trying to explain what you do when you are in that situation. So what should you do when you're in that situation? What you should do is, first of all, Google the problem. Search, how do I fix this on Google? Then if you still can't find an answer on Google, search on YouTube. And I explained that YouTube has vast amount of resources for you, right, to help you. You would encounter some videos and you'll be like, wow, this video was made specifically for me because it addresses the exact problem that you are trying to fix, right? So Google it first. If you can't find your answer on Google, search it on YouTube. Then after, you now reach out to people. And you can always reach out to me. I believe you guys would be on the WhatsApp group, so you have access to my number. You can always reach out to me, or you can also reach out to me on Twitter. Yeah, so here's my Twitter handle, Tolulopema Lomo. Yeah, so my name is Tolu. I don't know if I mentioned that. Alright, so you can also reach out to me on Twitter if you have blockers. But before you reach out to me on Twitter or anywhere, first Google it, then YouTube it, before you can now reach out to me. And you can also reach out to other people. You can reach out to people in this class as well that you feel like will be able to answer your questions. Alright, and the final tip is, try not to lose your cool when faced with problems. So while going through the feedback form, I saw something very funny. Someone said that he gets depressed easily when debugging. For those who don't know what debugging means when you are trying to fix an issue in your code. So a bug, there's something called a bug in software development, a bug is an issue, an error. That's what a bug is, right? So the person said that when he's trying to debug, so debug simply means you're trying to fix an issue, right? So that a bug is an issue, debugging is fixing an issue. So someone said he gets anxious and depressed, he gets anxiety when he's trying to fix bugs. Yeah, that happens to everybody, it happens to me as well. So, but one thing that will make you a good developer is when you can stay composed, when you have blockers, when you have bugs. You are trying to fix a bug, but you don't get overwhelmed and just get angry. Some people would even get angry and just throw their laptop away. Please don't do that. Okay. So when you are trying to fix a bug, stay calm, right? It happens to everybody. That's what makes you a developer, being able to fix problems, being able to solve problems, right? So does anybody have any question, any comment so far? If you do, raise your hand first and then I'll give you permission to unmute yourself and speak. All right, go ahead, Ayoko. Go ahead. Go ahead, Ayoko. I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce your name properly, but go ahead and ask your question or your comment. Okay, I can't seem to hear you. Okay, maybe you can try typing your question in the chat box as well, because I can't hear you. Does anybody else have a question or a comment? Anything that needs clarification? If nobody else would move on to the class proper. Alright, so it seems like nobody has anything to say. So let's move to the next slide. Alright, so there are some basic concepts that you need to understand as a web developer. Alright, so and the first of those concepts is what a network is. A network, right? You probably have heard network. Sometimes you'll be like, oh, the network is not good. So when you say that MTN network is not good, okay, I see a question dropped in the chat box. So it says, are we learning backend? So we're not learning backend in this course, right? This course is meant to be focused on the basics, and that's HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But I assure you that for you to be a good backend developer as well, you need to know this HTML, CSS, JavaScript, right? I'm a front-end engineer, but I also do backend. Yeah, so you need to know HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to do backend. Can we have our own WhatsApp group? Yeah, sure, we can. I'll create that and share it on the classroom afterwards. Thank you. Okay, so let's go back to the basic concept. So I was explaining what the network is, right? So sometimes someone will be like, MTN network is bad. There's no network in this place. Maybe you travel to your own town and there's no network. And sometimes you might raise your phone and be like, you'll be moving around the house. Where is network? So when we say network, what do we mean? Right? Of course, the word network is a generic word, so it can be used in different scenarios. But when we say network in web development, what do we mean, right? So a network is simply a group of computers. We all know what a computer is, right? So several computers that are connected together. And the reason why we connect these computers is so that we can share resources between the computers. Now, when I say a resource, what kind of resource am I referring to? A resource can be an image, a picture, can be a video, it can be a document. Those are examples of resources. Resources can even be hardware. For example, it's very possible that peradventure you're on your laptop now. It's very possible for me to access your laptop directly from my own laptop, right? So your computer is also a resource. So it's very possible that I can control your own computer from my computer. So you can also, having a network allows for that to be possible, right? So that's what a network is, a group of computers that are connected together so that we can share resources, right? So the internet now will be I'm very sure that we know what the internet is, or would have heard, at least heard of what the internet is. So when we say the internet now, the internet is a kind of network. We already said what a network is. A network is a group of computers that are connected together so that we can share resources. That is, resources refer to images, videos, documents, or hardware. What do I mean by hardware? Hardware is physical parts of a computer. Yeah, that's what hardware is. So an internet, or the internet, pardon me, the internet is an example of a network. Now, the special thing about the internet is that the internet is a global network. Now, it's very possible to have a local network. An example of a local network would be your phone. Maybe you put on your phone's hotspot and then you connect with your laptop. That's a local network. Or you have something like Zenda. Okay, you're connecting one phone to another phone. That's a local network, right? But when we talk about the internet is a global network. That means that it allows you to connect with computers all over the world. And that's really amazing, right? That means that even from Nigeria, I can have a friend that is in India. I can have a friend that is in London. I can have a friend that is in Paris, right? That's what the internet allows you to do. So the internet is actually a network, but this network is global. So it comprises of computers all over the world, right? So let's now talk about the web, or the World Wide Web. When you see you're trying to navigate to Facebook and you type in your URL bar, you type www.facebook.com. So that www there means World Wide Web, the World Wide Web. Now, what is the World Wide? Okay, and it's also known as the web, right? So what is the World Wide Web? Now, the World Wide Web is an application that is running on the internet. And what the World Wide Web does is that it allows you to now, it makes it easy to transfer web resources. Now, I already explained that the internet is a global network, computers connected all over the world, right? So the World Wide Web is built on top of the internet. And what the World Wide Web does is that it gives you like an interface to now access these resources. Without the World Wide Web, it will still be very possible to connect with computers all over the world, but you need to have like a very high level of tech skill. You have to be working with commands, and it's not going to be as easy as just going to open up a browser and typing a URL and just pressing enter. It's not going to be that easy without the World Wide Web. So the World Wide Web is an application that runs on the internet. Now, I don't know if all this sounds confusing, but you just need to have a surface level understanding of this concept to be a web developer. It's not like you're going to, if you apply for a job as a web developer, they might not really ask. It's possible they ask you, but it's not really that important for you to understand these things so deeply like that. But you should have an idea of what these things mean. So the World Wide Web is an application that runs on the internet. The World Wide Web is what we usually interact with. When you open your browser and you type a URL, what you are working with is the World Wide Web, also known as the web. Alright, so let's move. So does anybody have any question before I move on to the next slide? If you have a question, raise your hand. Or you can type your question in the chat box if you're shy, like me. So does anybody have a question? So I'll do a countdown. Count 5 seconds. If you have a question, ask within that 5 seconds. After that 5 seconds, if there's no question, we'll move on. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, nobody has a question. Let's move on. Okay. So now we talked about network, we talked about the internet, we talked about the World Wide Web. talked about the World Wide Web. So now we're talking about a web browser, right? So I already told you that what we usually interact with, what the average person interacts with, is the web. That's what we work with. We don't work directly with the internet, we don't work directly with the network, the global network, right? But we work with the web, right? So how we have access to the web is through our web browser. That's what we, and of course, we all know what a web browser is, right? So it's the web browser that we use to access web pages. Now, remember I told you that the a network, and the internet is also a network. Remember I told you that it's simply computers that are connected together so that we can access resources. Now, one of those resources are the websites that we see when we open our browsers. Those websites are actually documents. So it's one of the resources that network, which is the internet, allows you to access. Am I making sense? If I'm making sense, can you leave a thumbs up in the chat section? So one of those resources that the internet allows us to have access to is these web pages. So web pages are really just documents, and you're going to see this. Okay, someone has a question. Go ahead to ask your question, Ichiro.
I'm sorry for calling you. Have you guys gone far? I'm sorry.
No, we haven't gone too far. Yes, and after the class, I'll also make a recording available.
Oh, thank you, sir.
You're welcome. So let's move on. Okay, so we're talking about the web browser, right? So whenever you open up your web browser and you type in a URL, what you're accessing, that website you see, is actually a document, right? And I said that networks that, okay, let me just do a brief recap of what I said before. I talked about the network, a network, right? And the network is a group of computers that are connected so that we can share resources. And I now said the internet is a type of network. But something special about the internet is that it's a global network. It's a network of computers that are all around the world. And then I now moved on to say that the web, which is what we usually interact with, is built on top of the internet. And the web is to allow us to access these resources really easily. So the major resource that we usually access on the web is web pages, websites. And web pages are actually documents, right? So let's do something really quickly. So it says here, what are some common web browsers you know? Right, so I'll be calling people. I'm not going to be nice. I'll be calling people, and when I call you, you just tell me one web browser. All right, so I'm going to start with Ruth Adibola Chayola. Good evening. So tell me one web browser that you know. Awesome. So Prince Will Jr. Could you tell me one web browser that you know? Awesome. Okay, next person. Opeyemi. Just tell me one web browser you know. Awesome. Then last person. Semiloluwa. Just tell me one web browser you know. Are you there, Semiloluwa? Okay, I don't think he or she is there. Chisom George. Please tell me one web browser you know. Thank you, Internet Explorer. There's something about Internet Explorer. So when you start writing, building websites, you find out that a lot of web developers hate Internet Explorer. You find out why. All right. So thank you very much. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay. So we're looking at how the web works. You kind of have a glimpse of how the web works by now, because I talked about it a little, but let's now look at it in detail, right? Okay, so okay, Temiloluwa said Safari. Thank you, Temiloluwa. Okay, so how does the web work? Now, when you want to access a website, for example, Twitter, what do you do? Let's assume you're not using the app now because Twitter has the app. But when you want to access Twitter, what you usually do is you open up your web browser, maybe Google Chrome or Edge or Brave. And then when you go into your web browser, you look for the URL bar. And then you now type twitter.com. You type something like this. Okay, maybe HTTPS. Most times we don't type that. It's usually there for us, it's usually added for us. And you can type www. That W part is optional, right? But the major part, we type something like twitter.com, right? And then next, before we know it, in a flash, if your internet is very fast, in a flash, you get the web page back and you see Twitter and you can see all the posts and all. But if you're using Glow, you may have to wait for like 1 minute to see your web page. Alright, that's just a joke. Okay, so you type in twitter.com in your URL bar. And so what happens is, now your browser, you can see something called the client here. So the client is actually referring to your browser. Okay, your browser is what we call the client. That's one thing you should know, right? So when you type that URL, twitter.com, into your browser, which is the client, what it does is that your browser is actually making a request to something called a server. Now, what's a server? A server is actually a computer as well, right? But what the server does is that the server is like a storage house. So what it does is that it stores your web pages. So that means that the Twitter website is actually on a computer somewhere in the world, a physical computer, right? That physical computer stores the web page for Twitter. So whenever you go to your web browser and you type twitter.com and you press enter, what you're doing is you are sending a request to that computer that is storing the web page for Twitter. And so when the computer receives that request, what it does is that it will answer you to send a response. And the response it sends is the web page. Remember I told you that the web page is a document. So what it sends back is a web page. Now, the question would be, okay, so how does the server know that I'm asking for Twitter, right? The way that the server knows is because of this URL, okay? The full meaning of URL, you probably have heard that term before. URL is Uniform Resource Locator. And we'll talk about the URL more, right? So do we understand, do we have a basic idea of this? Or do you want me to explain it again? If you understand, leave a thumbs up. If you want me to explain it again, type explain it again. I'll be waiting for your response. Okay, Oladimeji understands. Okay, so C Young says explain it again, so I'll explain it again. Right. So I said you're familiar with web browsers already, like Chrome, Firefox, Opera, and the likes. So another name for a web browser is client. So whenever in web development we say something like client refers to your web browser. Okay. So I was explaining what happens when you are visiting a website, and I used Twitter as an example. So what you usually do is, you open up your browser, maybe Chrome for example, and then you type twitter.com and then you press enter, and then after a few seconds you see the web page on your screen. You see Twitter, you see all the posts and all that, the notifications and the likes. So what happened behind the scenes was that immediately you pressed enter, your client made a request to another computer somewhere, and that computer is called the server. This is a server here. So immediately you press twitter.com and you press enter, your browser is sending a request to the server. How can your browser reach that server, which is another computer? The computer might even be in another country. So how does your browser reach that server? the way your browser reaches that server is through the network. I told you that in the previous slides that the internet is a network and it comprises of computers all around the world, right? So when you press enter in your browser, what's happening is that you are sending a request to the server. And so what the server does when you and okay, I said the server is a computer, and that computer stores the web page you are looking for. So there's a computer somewhere that is storing the web page for Twitter. So when you go into your browser and you press the URL and you press enter, what's happening is your own browser is now sending a request to that computer that is storing twitter.com. So immediately the server, which is the computer storing Twitter, immediately it receives your request. What it does is that it will now send a response back to your browser, and that response is the web page that you see. The response is the web page that you see, and it's actually a document. It's a document. We'll talk about that more. So I now also said something about that twitter.com that you type in your browser is actually called a URL, and the full meaning of URL is Uniform Resource Locator. And we're going to explain more about the URL. I'll talk more about that in the next slide. But do we understand that now? Okay, do you understand what I just explained now?
Power off.
Okay, you said someone says, what is the difference between the host and the server? It's actually the same thing. The host and the server is the same thing. Another name for server is the host. Alright, so I think we can move on to the next slide now. Alright, so I introduced you to the URL here. Twitter.com is actually an example of a URL. So let's talk more about the URL. Okay, so it says, I have a short text here. It says, just as buildings and houses have a street address, web pages also have a unique address, or they have unique addresses to help people locate them. It's just like maybe I want to visit, if I want to visit, say, Dimlolua, right? Dimlolua has an house address. The reason why I'll be able to visit him is because I know his house address. If I don't know his house address, I can't visit him, right? So URLs are like addresses for the web. But rather than being addresses to houses, they are addresses to servers. So when I want to go to Twitter, I'll have to type the address for Twitter, which is the URL, twitter.com. So once I type twitter.com, the web already knows that, this person is trying to get the web page at Twitter. So the same way that two houses cannot have the same address, it's the same way that two web pages cannot have the same URL. URLs are unique. Okay, so now I'm going to explain. I just want to explain more about the URL, right? So the URL can be broken down into some parts. Okay, 3 parts at the basic level, right? Now the first part, from HTTPS down to this this second forward slash, is called a protocol. And what a protocol is a set of rules and regulations that govern how transfer of resources happens on the web. Let me give an example about that because it might seem very abstract. So let's assume I want to talk with maybe Chisom, and let's assume that I understand only Yoruba and Chisom understands only Igbo. That communication cannot work because he understands Igbo and understands Yoruba. So one of the rules that would have to put in place for both of us to communicate would be that we would need to speak the same language. So either I learn how to speak Igbo and then we now start speaking Igbo together, or he learns how to speak Yoruba and then we now start speaking, or we both speak English, right? So the same way we have rules like that in real life. Or another rule might be maybe like how fast you talk. Have you had, I don't know if you've had conversations with people where, oh, this person is the person you're talking with is talking really fast and you're like, hey, slow down, I can't understand you. So that can be another rule. So you have to talk at a rate at which I can understand. Or you can have someone, maybe you're chatting with a professor, right? Someone who understands English a lot. So another rule might be that the professor has to speak English you can understand. The professor cannot be speaking big grammar for you that don't really understand English that much. So that can be another rule. So the same way we have rules in real life that govern how we communicate, for you to understand me, there has to be some things that we need to do to put in place for the communication to happen smoothly. That's the same way that on the web we also have rules that govern how transfer of resources happen on the internet, right? So it's called HTTPS, and we'll still look into that in more detail, right? So the basic parts of a URL, there's the protocol. That's the rules that govern transfer of resources. I just explained that. And we also have the domain name. Now, if you've been in the web space before, maybe if you already know how to use something like WordPress or website generators, you probably have heard of domain name. Now, domain name is like maybe something like a street. Let's say like a street, right? So domain name is what we use to identify the URL. So that's like the most profound one. That's the one that stands out the most. Google.com. When I say, oh, Google.com, I know that it's Google's website I'm looking for. Then we also have subdirectory. So subdirectory would be like, let's see what example. Okay, so subdirectory would be like a location inside that particular domain name. Okay, let's assume that Google is an estate. Maybe there's an estate in Nigeria called Google. So then inside Google, then we now have some maybe smaller streets. So Gmail will now be like a street in Google estate. Does that make sense? If that makes sense, please give a thumbs up. Right, so the subdirectory is like a location inside the domain name. And remember, like I said before, that this URL is like an address to a server somewhere, right? So the subdirectory will just be telling you like, oh, somewhere inside this address. That's what the subdirectory is referring to. Okay, so does that make sense? Please let me know if you don't understand. Don't be scared to use the chat box. If you don't understand, let me know so I can go over it again. Right, so let's move to the next slide. Still explaining URLs. Right. So URLs can get slightly more complex. So we have the same protocol that I already explained from the last slide. Protocol is rules and regulations that explain how transfer of files happen on the web. Now we can now have a subdomain. So a subdomain is also like a place within the domain name. Now this is something we can easily relate with. If I type google.com, I know I'm going to like the top level website. But if I say ads, for those of us that have gone into something like digital marketing, if I say ads is short for advertisement. So if I type ads.google.com, well, I'm saying I want to go to the ads section of Google. So it's really just like a classification as well. And then of course we have the subdirectory that we talked about before. Now it's very okay if all this sounds a bit complex. Over time you'll get used to it. Okay, so let's move on. Alright, so let's have a quick test. Yeah, don't worry if you fail this test, there's no problem. Alright, so I'll be calling out people to tell me the different parts of this website. So who can tell me? No, I won't call out anybody. You can just unmute yourself and let me know if you know the answer. So I need someone to help me identify C. What is letter C here representing? What part of the URL is letter C representing? So if you know the answer, just unmute yourself and speak. Okay, go ahead, Ruth. Thank you very much. Round of applause. All right. Someone else. What does A stand for? Thank you very much. Then what does B stand for? Yes, thank you very much. C Young and Opeyemi. Then what does I think we've yeah, what does D stand for? That's the last one. Anybody? Yes. Yes, thank you very much. D stands for the sub directory. So we have a fairly basic understanding of how URLs work now. So let's move on. Okay, yes, so we talked about protocols in this slide, right? And I mentioned that a protocol is simply a set of rules and regulations that govern how files are transferred on the web. So let's take a deeper look at that, right? So the full meaning of the protocol we saw is HTTP. There are actually different types of protocols, but the most common one is HTTP, right? And the full meaning of that is Hypertext Transfer Protocol, right? Like I explained before, it's the set of rules that is used for transmitting data on the web. Then we also have another version of that, which is HTTPS. Now this one you probably have seen something like that, HTTPS. Now HTTPS is actually an extension of HTTP, but what's different about HTTPS is that HTTPS is used for secure communication. So when you need your website to be secure, when you are doing something that has to do with sensitive data, maybe you're creating a payment system, or you're working with something that has, maybe you're working on a website that deals with sensitive information, personal information, we use HTTPS because that's more secure than HTTP. Next slide. All right, so we've gotten to kind of like the fun part. So what are the technologies used on the web? So technologies that are used on the web are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So we'll be looking at each of these technologies one by one. So HTML means hypertext markup language, right? CSS means cascading style sheets, and then JS means JavaScript, right? So let's take a deeper look at HTML, what HTML is all about. So like I said before, that HTML means hypertext markup language, right? So it says here that HTML is the standard markup language for creating web pages and web applications. It's a markup language. Now take note, I deliberately made the word markup bold, right? Because it's not a programming language, right? There are programming languages, but HTML is not a programming language. HTML is actually a markup language. Now what does the word markup mean? Markup means how data is presented. That's what markup means. For example, you are working in Microsoft Word, and then you've typed out your documents before, but then you now go ahead and make a particular title bold, or you make it underlined, or you make it italicized. That's markup. You are changing how the data is being presented. So that's what HTML does, right? And HTML is like the foundation for websites. All the contents that we add, all the paragraphs you see, all the pictures, all the videos, and everything is added with HTML. Okay? So when you see an HTML file, because I mentioned before that web pages are documents. Okay, so web pages are written with HTML, right? So when you see a file that ends with .html or .htm, that's referring to a web page. So let's move on to the next technology now and start CSS. All right, so CSS means cascading style sheets. Now what CSS does is that CSS allows you to control the appearance of your website. So when you see a website that looks really beautiful, that has colors, that has um, animations, that has beautiful fonts, we do that using CSS. And CSS is also not a programming language. It's called a style sheet because it's used for styling, for adding style to your web pages, right? And CSS files end with .css. So let's move on to the next technology, and that's JavaScript. Now, so of all the three that we've mentioned before, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, JavaScript is the only programming language. And JavaScript is the language that is used on the web. It's used to program the web. And JavaScript actually runs in a web browser. Okay. For some other programming languages, I don't know if you've probably worked with any other programming language. There are programming languages that don't need to work inside your browser. But for JavaScript, JavaScript only runs in the browser, with some exceptions, right? So what JavaScript is used for is, JavaScript is used to make your page interactive and dynamic. For example, I have a page, maybe something like this page we're looking at now. And maybe when I click on the word JavaScript, I want it to become red. Or I want it to change its position, I want to move it up when I click on it. So we do things like that with JavaScript. Or most of you would have seen websites where you have like a menu bar. So once you touch the menu bar, the menu comes up. Once you click on the close icon, the menu goes away. Things like that, we use JavaScript to do those things. And JavaScript files have names that end with .js. Now note, you probably have heard of Java. Java is another programming language. Now, I want you to know that Java and JavaScript have nothing to do with each other, right? Java is different, it's completely different from JavaScript, right? But the makers of JavaScript deliberately named the language JavaScript because at that time when JavaScript was made, Java was a very popular language. So they wanted to capitalize on the fact that Java was popular. So they also named their own programming language JavaScript. It's just like, let's say we have Indomie now. Indomie is very popular, like the most popular noodles. So I'm now creating another type of noodles. And I know that Indomie is very popular. So I now name my own noodles Indomie Plus Plus. I'm sure that's a very silly example, right? But that's kind of what they were trying to do. Java was already a very popular language, so they were making JavaScript, and we want JavaScript to also be a very popular language. So let's add Java to our name. Let's call it JavaScript. So that's what happened. So it's not like JavaScript has anything to do with Java. They are two different languages. Okay, so let's take a deeper look at JavaScript. Alright, so let's quickly look at the history and versions of Java. Right, so JavaScript was, I said Java, I actually meant JavaScript. JavaScript was created by Brendan Eich in 1995 for Netscape Navigator. Netscape Navigator was actually the first browser, right? So it was created by Brendan Eich, who was working with Netscape Navigator. And the reason why they created JavaScript was because at that point they only had static web pages that you could not interact with. Just static. They just stayed there. You're just like, you could only just scroll through them. That was all you could do. You could not interact with it. You could not touch it and something happens. You could not maybe drag it around, things like that. No, you couldn't do that before. So that was why they created JavaScript. So JavaScript was created to add all that functionality to web pages. And so after a while, when JavaScript was created, it was submitted to ECMA. ECMA is short for European Computer Manufacturers Association, right? So it's like a body for computer manufacturers. So it was submitted. JavaScript was submitted to ECMA to be made a standard. What do we mean? What do I mean by standard? For those of us who are science students, when we say something like, if I say 1 centimeter, wherever you go in the world, 1 centimeter is the same as 1 centimeter. If I'm in the US, if I'm in Nigeria, if I'm in Germany, 1 centimeter is the same thing as 1 centimeter. So 1 centimeter is a standard. So what that means is that they all agreed, countries agreed that, oh, when we say 1 centimeter, 1 centimeter should represent this. So it can be used anywhere, something that we agree on. So when we say that JavaScript was submitted to ECMA to be made a standard, what that means is that they were agreeing that, oh, JavaScript should be used on web browsers, on all the web browsers, on different web browsers. That's what it meant, right? So as at that time, there were several, although Netscape Navigator was the first browser, there were other browsers that were being made at that time, and naturally, different people wanted to bring their own versions of JavaScript. Yeah, so there were many different versions of JavaScript. So JavaScript was submitted to ECMA so that it can be made a standard. So what that will mean is that, so everybody agrees or will be using JavaScript to make our web pages dynamic. So that was what happened. So that was done sometime after 1995, and the first standard was now released in 1997, and they called it ECMAScript. Right, ECMAScript. So you might be wondering, which one is ECMAScript again? Right. So the reason why they called it ECMAScript is not just because they wanted to just change the name, but there were actually some legal issues with the name JavaScript. They could not use that name JavaScript, so they just had to call it another name. So that's why they called it ECMAScript. So ECMAScript was released in 1997. Right. So after ECMAScript was released, they now started building on top of ECMAScript, that is adding features to ECMAScript, which is the same thing as JavaScript. Okay, so that's something you might see somewhere. You might hear somebody refer to JavaScript as ECMAScript. It's the same thing. JavaScript and ECMAScript is the same thing. Alright? So they started working on ECMAScript, which is also JavaScript, after that time, and so by 1999 they released another version of ECMAScript, and that's ECMAScript 3. They released that in 1999, and they kept on working on it. So logically, after ECMAScript 3, there should be ECMAScript 4. But however, there was never an ECMAScript 4. It was never released, and it was never released because there was a conflict on how the programming language should move forward. There was a disagreement, right? So they never released ECMAScript. They never released ECMAScript 4, and they skipped ECMAScript 4 and finally released ECMAScript 5, and they released that in 2009. And ECMAScript 5 is like the major version that most browsers support, that a lot of browsers support. That's like the major version, ECMAScript 5, and it's short for ES5. It's very difficult pronouncing ECMAScript every time. So ES5, right? That refers to ECMAScript 5. So that was released in 2009. After 10 years, they released ECMAScript 5, and they also released ECMAScript 6, which is ECMAScript 2015. So how did they get the names, right? At this point, they decided that they were going to be using the years to name the version. So they called the ECMAScript 2015. So just add 1 to the 5, ECMAScript 6, right? So since then, they've been releasing yearly updates. So after ECMAScript 2015, which is ES6, they released ECMAScript 2016, which is ES7. And after that, they released ECMAScript 2017, which is ES8. So as at now, 2022, the latest version of JavaScript we have is ECMAScript 2022, which is ES13. Yeah. So with each new version, they keep adding some things to JavaScript. So by 2023 as well, they release ECMAScript 14, and they will add some things to JavaScript as well. All right. Okay. So we've talked about all those concepts, and I hope that we at least got a basic understanding of those things. So that's what I decided to talk about this as well. So why should I be a web developer? Right? Some reasons why you should be a web developer if you've been having doubts before. Right? So reasons why you should be a web developer. Number one, there's a high demand for web developers. The US Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that employment of web developers is projected to grow by 15% from 2016 to 2026, much faster than the average for all occupations. Imagine that. At least the employment of web developers is growing faster than the employment of any other occupation. And it says that the demand will be driven by the growing popularity of mobile devices and e-commerce. So more and more people are using phones. More and more people are putting their business online. So because people are putting their business online, there's going to be need for more web developers, right? Another reason why you should be a web developer is because the pay is good, right? That's a fun part. The pay is good. The average developer salary in the United States is $75,773. That's roughly 32 million naira every year. That's the average pay of web developers, and it's very very possible, because someone might be like, oh, that's in the United States. What about Nigeria? It's very very possible to work with a company in the US while you're in Nigeria. Very very possible. Right, so that's a good reason why you should be a web developer. The pay is good. And then another reason why you should be a web developer is because it's easy to get into web development. You don't need a very expensive computer. For those of us who joined at the beginning of, who started with me, I told you about how I got started into coding. Now, when I started programming, when I started in software development, I wanted to learn game development. That was what I wanted to learn, because I was in secondary school. What do you expect? Alright, so one of the reasons why I could not continue with that was my computer was not powerful enough, right? So for game development, you need like a really expensive computer. But web development is not like that. All you need is a very cheap, small laptop, and that has access to internet, and you need a desire to learn. Alright, and I also said that if you don't have a desire to learn, desire for money is also good as well. If the money is all you want, it's fine. Alright, you just need something to drive you. And another reason why you should be a web developer is because you can work remotely. So you can work for a company in the US, you can work for a company anywhere, right from Nigeria. You don't have to leave your house. You don't have to go through, if you're in Lagos, you don't have to go through the traffic and all that. You can just work from your house at your own convenience. Yeah. Okay, okay, let's see. Let's move on to the next slide. So, remember I told you that every website or every web page that you visit is actually a document. And I explained before in the previous slides that HTML is actually what we use to create that document. Right? So it's an actual file. Every website you see is an actual file. So let's talk more about HTML documents now. Let's see, so that we can gradually transition into writing our own HTML pages. So every HTML page is made up of HTML elements. And so it's like text, something you can write, right? It's code, so you write it, right? So this is the general structure of HTML elements. There's usually something called a tag, right? So for every HTML element, this is like a model for an HTML element. So for this now, this is an HTML element. It has three parts. The first part is the opening tag, and the opening tag is made up of a less than sign, or some people also call it angular brackets. Yeah, angular brackets. So a less than sign. Then there's going to be a name. This tag name changes depending on the elements you want to create. Then there's also going to be a right hand side. A right hand greater than sign. A greater than sign. Alright, so this is what we call an opening tag. Then in between the opening tag and the closing tag, there's going to be content. Now the content is the actual text. Okay, let me see if I can give you an example of this. No, we'll get there. So for every HTML element, each HTML element has an opening tag, which is this, something like that looks like this. Then there's a content in between the tag, and then there's now a closing tag. The opening tag and closing tag are identical. The only difference is that there's a forward slash after the less than sign here. You can see here that there's no slash for the opening tag. It's just the less than sign, the name of the tag, and then the right and the greater than sign, then the content. But for a closing tag, there's a less than sign, then there's a forward slash, and then we now have the tag name, then we now have the greater than sign. So the difference between the opening tag and the closing tag is just this forward slash, right? Okay. Now, I already explained this. This is an example of an element. So it's also possible to write your HTML elements like this, because something you write. I think I mentioned that before. Something you actually write. It's also very possible to write your HTML elements like this. Now, this, what you see in this first part and what you see in the second part are completely the same. The only difference between them is that here there's a couple of spaces and new lines. So when you're writing HTML, the browser would usually ignore your spaces, except for a space that is in between. Every space that you write, when you write, if you had like 5 spaces, the browser would remove the 5 spaces and just leave 1 space there, right? So what I did here, or what was done here, was I put the content on a new line, and then I also put the closing tag on a new line. So the output of this is going to be the same as the output of this. Pardon me if everything looks really abstract now, but you get to understand what I'm saying, right? So one reason why you would want to write your code like this is to make it organized, right? So when you're writing code, one thing that you should keep in mind is that you want your code to be organized. So what will happen now is I'll just show you a quick example of what I'm saying. I'll just look for a website that I'll just give you a quick look at the code. Give me a minute. Let me see if I can quickly bring up a website for you to see. Alright, so I'll be sharing my screen now. Alright, so can you see my screen? If you can see my screen, leave a thumbs up in the comment section. Can you see my screen? Just let me know if you can see my screen. Okay, thank you. Alright, so this is an example of HTML code, right? So this is an example of HTML code. So let's look at one example. Now let's look at this, where it says we love all cookies, exclamation mark. Now you can see what I told you, the less than sign, the greater than sign, and then you see something in between, li. Now li is the tag name. If you remember the slide I showed you just now. Now this is the opening tag, and you see at the other end of the line there's something similar, and that's the closing tag, right? Now they look almost identical, but the only difference is that this has a forward slash, and then in between the two tags we now have content. Now this we love all cookies is the content. So what this does is that anything that you put in between these two tags is going to be formatted, is going to be presented, right? Let's look at another example. Another tag is this cookies. Then you see the opening tag here, you see the closing tag here, and then we also see the content. And you see that here we had li inside the greater than sign and less than sign, but here we have h2 between the greater than sign and less than sign. So this is a different type of tag, but you see here that we have an opening tag, we also have a closing tag here, which are almost the same, but the difference is the forward slash, right? So these are examples of HTML elements. Examples of HTML elements. Okay, so we'll stop here for today. We'll stop here for today. Does anybody have any question? Does anybody have any questions so far before we end the call? If no one has a question, I'll do a very, very fast review of everything I did from the beginning, and then we'll end the class. Does anybody have any question? Okay, it seems nobody has a question. So, okay. Dafe, do you have a question? Okay, go. Yes, we are. All right. Any other question? Okay, I don't think we have any question. So let me do a very fast recap of everything we talked about today, and I'll end the class. Okay, so okay. Alright, so I explained what a network is, and I said a network is a group of computers that are connected so that we can share resources like pictures, images, audio files. And I told you that the internet, is an example of a network. But what is special about the internet is that it's a global network that allows computers all around the world to connect with each other. And I told you that the web, also known as the World Wide Web, which is www, is an application that works on the internet. And what the web does is, the web is actually what we interact with. The web is what you usually work with when you open your web browser. And the web just makes it easy to access resources. Then I said that the web browser is the application that allows us to access these web resources. Then I also explained, I gave you a brief example of how the web works. I told you that when you type your URL in the browser, what you are doing is you are sending a request to a server. A server is a computer that stores the web pages. So when you send a request to the server returns the web page back, and that's what you see on your screen. Then I also said that I explained about the URL, that the URL has several parts. It has the protocol, which is rules and regulations that tell how data is transferred on the internet. And I also talked about the domain name. The domain name is just like what we use to identify the website or web page. And I also talked about the subdirectory. The subdirectory is like a location inside that particular address. And I said that URL is just like an address, just like an house address. Like, for example, I want to visit Temilolua. I'll need this address or our address before I can visit that person, right? So once you have this address, you give this address to your browser, you type to your browser, you press enter, and it knows which server to look for, right? I also give you some other examples. You can also have a subdomain as part of your URL. Then we had a short quiz. This is protocol, subdomain, domain, subdirectory. And I told you that HTTP means, which is the protocol we talked about, means hypertext transfer protocol. There's another version which is HTTPS. That's a secure version of HTTP. We talked about the technologies used on the web: HTML, CSS, JavaScript. I told you HTML is what we use to write the web pages, the documents that are the actual website. We use HTML to write it. And I said it's a markup language, not a programming language. So what it does, it presents how our data looks on the website. We'll look at that more in the next class. I told you that CSS allows us to change the appearance of our website, allows us to make it beautiful. And then I also said CSS files end with .css. I also mentioned that HTML pages end with .html or .htm. Then I talked about JavaScript. I said JavaScript is the only programming language out of those three, and it runs in the browser, and JavaScript makes our web pages dynamic. We also talked about the versions of JavaScript and the history of JavaScript, and I told you reasons why you should be a web developer. And then finally, I told you that every web page Every HTML page is built with HTML elements, and then I showed you the structure of HTML elements, that there's a opening tag, a closing tag, and the content. The content inside is what will be formatted. The tag name determines how the content will be formatted. Right? So yeah, and I also showed you that you can also rearrange your elements like this so that they look nice. Okay, so we'll stop here for today. Thank you very much for joining the class, and I hope you learned from this. Yeah, so on the classroom, the Google Classroom, okay, go ahead, but be really fast. You raise your hand. Yes, it's recorded. So it's be I'll all right. I'll send it to you on the classroom, the Google Classroom. Okay. Yes. Yeah, I'll share the slides as well. Okay, I'll share the slides as well. Yeah. So thank you very much for joining in. So I'll probably drop assignments. When I say assignment, don't be scared. It's just going to be a video that you can watch, and maybe things you can read as well, to help you solidify your understanding of the things I've explained today. Okay. So thank you guys very much for joining in, and I'll see you in the next class. Bye. Bye everyone. Yes, I'll share the slides. Yeah. And I'll create the WhatsApp group as well. Bye.